Yeah, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome here at the panel discussion on German-Swedish relations during the Cold War at the German residence. So some of you might have attended our National Day only a few weeks ago to celebrate the Day of National Unity and the fall of the Berlin Wall 32 years ago. So the day, as I said back then, stands for peace and freedom. It brings at the same time very different memories to all of us. Memories also that I have from my East and West German family history. So still today, as we sit here, details emerge and facts about this history and the emotions we carry in us. And so they're still being analyzed by researchers. So we still keep learning from the past as we sit here. So today we want to take a closer look at the Swedish citizens, the contribution of Swedish citizens as escape helpers, as well as the central role of the so-called permanent mission of the Federal Republic of Germany in East Berlin in humanitarian issues during the division of Germany. So people who witnessed these fateful events or were even part of it are present today. Some of them even here today with us at the German residence. So thank you so much for being here, either in person or for joining digitally. So without further ado, let me introduce our two main speakers. So I'm happy to welcome Dr. Jacqueline Boysen here to Stockholm, who has traveled from Berlin. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Jacqueline Boysen is the director of the newly founded Chancellor Helmut Kohl Foundation, Bundeskanzler Helmut Kohl Stiftung. Sounds a little bit easier for me, say it in German. Until recently, she has worked as the chief speechwriter at the German Parliament, writing speeches for the presidents of the German Bundestag, like Norbert Lammert, Wolfgang Schäuble, and also the current president, Bärbel Bas. For many years, Mrs. Boysen has previously worked as a correspondent for the German radio broadcast Deutschlandfunk and Deutsche Welle, focusing on education, history, and collective memory. So as a historian, Jacqueline Boysen has dug deeply into the recent German history. She's author of one of the first biographies about former Chancellor Angela Merkel. And in her PhD thesis, actually that time we met, my husband and I met you, we will hear more about that later, she studied the history of the permanent representation of the Federal Republic in the DDR. So in this book, which we will hear more about, that it's entitled Das Weiße Haus in Ost-Berlin, meaning the White House. So warm welcome to you, Jacqueline Boysen.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks.
And let me introduce our second panelist. So very happy to introduce you, Ingrid Törnqvist, a writer and journalist. So very well known to the Swedish audience today, famous from Swedish TV. And so Ingrid was a foreign correspondent for the Swedish SVT television and was in Germany, actually posted in Germany during the fall of when the wall came down. So Ingrid is author of the book Carl-Gustaf Svingel and the Family of Sylvia in Cold War Berlin, where she reveals the life and work of a very interesting personality, Carl-Gustaf Svingel, that we might hear about or will hear about more during this afternoon. So actually Svingel was called a secret diplomat, whatever that means, by the German news magazine Der Spiegel about 20 years ago. And I'm sure that we will all understand why Spiegel chose to call him that way. So I'm very much looking forward to your presentations, and I would first like to hand over to you, Dr. Boysen, for your presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm very glad to have the opportunity to add to this this afternoon some results of my historical research and to hear what Ingrid is telling us about Svingel. It's always a different, whether you talk about an institution or whether you talk about people's faith. So excuse me for jumping into formal, more or less formal details. I do this in order to try to wake up our memories, talking about a vanished world. Come in, and there are more seats over there. So, as the ambassador said, my main topics are the ständige Vertretung der Bundesrepublik bei der DDR, the permanent mission of West Germany in East Berlin, and the refugees from the GDR. Perhaps I don't need this microphone because I have that one. Woo! Okay, so you see the White House, which gave its name to my book and my thesis, the White House in East Berlin. This White House was a very important building in times of Cold War. It opened up in the 70s, I will tell you later, and the Federal Republic of Germany kept it always in clean white in order to show presence in GDR. Looking back on the history of GDR from 1949 to the end of 90s, most destabilizing for the regime was our second subject, the escape from GDR. From the beginning, many thousand people left. In 1960, just 1 year, in 1960, for example, 200,000 people crossed the border. In 61, before the Berlin Wall was built, 550 persons per day reached West Berlin, only West Berlin, not counting those who came on the so-called green border in the other parts of the separated Germany. Nearly 3 million people left GDR from 49 to 61 when the Berlin Wall was closed, when the border was closed. By the way, my Swedish is non-existing, so I apologize for bothering you with my poor English. I think many people here will speak German, but we agreed on talking English, so I will do what I can. You probably remember the pictures of 1,000 young East German refugees stuck in West German embassies in Prague, Budapest, or Warsaw in 1989. This, their decision to leave home and to know you would probably not be allowed to come back, this decision contributed a lot to the collapse of the regime in East Berlin, but on the whole. Those who left at the time of the peaceful revolution, as well as in the years before, were well-educated people, many of them with an academic or a Christian background, middle-class people, we should say today, young people searching liberty, the pursuit of happiness and individual destiny. This migration, still today, marks population in Eastern Germany, which is not often discussed, by the way. I will come later to the point how they left. Let's have a look on the situation in the times after the Second World War. Germany was divided, as you probably know, according to the four main allies who defeated Nazi Germany in 4 parts. In May 49, the British, the American, and the French zone, the federal, founded the Federal Republic, in these 3 parts, the American, the British, and the French zone of Germany, the Federal Republic of Germany was founded, and in October, the GDR was proclaimed in the Soviet sector of Germany. This separation, of course, harmed a lot, separated lots of families and friends, especially after the wall had been built up in August 61. officially, no contact between East and West. The atmosphere was frozen. The Berlin Wall was a symbol of two powers. I show you, just to remind you how the situation was, some photos. This was, of course, the western side from the Berlin Wall. I show you these pictures to show you how important it was to build up officially contacts only in the 1970s. When Willy Brandt became chancellor in '69, his government achieved an important political change. We call it Wandel durch Annäherung, change by approachment. He established contact to the Soviet Union and the communist states in Eastern Europe to understand how difficult it was at that time to overcome the situation in Germany. We have to look at the legal background of the two hemispheres. Again, the situation on the border, the Grenzübergang. The Federal Republic of Germany in the West never accepted the division of the German nation and strictly refused to recognize GDR formally as a sovereign state. This is an essential point for the fact of establishing contact. The constitutions in both parts of Germany were not comparable at that point because Western Germany, the constitutions contradicted each other, we can say. In GDR, in the 70s, even the constitution showed they wanted to be regarded as a socialist nation. No longer a German nation, but a socialist nation. And of course not as part of the divided German nation. They wanted to be member of the United Nations. They wanted to have two Olympic teams. And this, in our memory, as we are mostly born after the building up of the wall, this is the normal situation we faced, but it was not normal. And that's why I like to point it out to show you how great this success, let's say, of Willy Brandt was to establish contact. GDR at that time suffered, let's say, from an inferiority complex. Erich Honecker, as General Secretary of the leading socialist party, the SED, wanted to be accepted as head of an independent state, and he was very lucky to have photos and meetings and relations like this, where the Chancellor of West Germany and he, as the leader of East Germany, talk to each other in Augenhöhe on the same level. Whereas on the other side, the Federal Republic emphasized the division as temporarily, a situation that needed to be changed someday. The constitution in West Germany, therefore, was not called constitution, but, as you probably know, Grundgesetz. It was meant to be only a provisional agreement, although a large majority of West German population did not really believe in a change. They mainly were orientated in Western Europe. The belief in overcoming the Deutsche Teilung, the separation, continually decreased. In eastern part of Germany, most people resignated. They lived a life according to the status quo and took the line of least resistance to the SED, the leading party. And the large majority complained in private context, but some perhaps dreamt of reforms, and a very, very small minority tried to protest, knowing, of course, about the risk of being persecuted. And some tried to move, although they knew about the oppression they were facing, while asking for permission to leave. The famous Ausreiseantrag. In case they applied for the permission, the Ausreiseantrag, they often lost their jobs. They had to leave university, for example, and were deprived in many different ways. When Chancellor Willy Brandt and his government, let's come back to the political sphere, established official negotiations with their Eastern counterparts in the beginning of the 70s. Both sides finally agreed in a so-called basic agreement, Grundlagenvertrag. Although negotiation was really hard, they overcame fundamental obstacles. They agreed to disagree instead of insisting on the different point of views. They emphasized the idea of special relations between East and West. Here we have the Akkreditierung, I don't know the English term, sorry, of the first head of ständige Vertretung, Günter Gauss, who got the official paper that he now is the ambassador of West Germany, which had never been called ambassador. The Steff, situated in the city center of Berlin, worked like a diplomatic institution, but it was never called an embassy. And yeah, we found this name of Leiter der ständigen Vertretung to avoid the term of ambassador. They had, of course, a diplomatic status. They were allowed to travel. The staff could pass the border anytime without being stopped or controlled. In times, as you know, in times when people in East Germany did not get a passport and were not allowed to travel to the West. All state ceremonies still showed the different point of views. East Germany demanded official parades, like you see it on the photo, and the West tried to avoid it. Here we see the third head of the ständige Vertretung, Hans-Otto Bräutigam, whose face, I don't know whether you can see it clearly, but he's not very lucky at this ceremony. Willy Brandt himself found out quickly what diplomatic pitfalls were involved in opening contact to the East. As you know, he had to resign in May '74 after a spy from GDR, Günther Guillaume, had been uncovered among the inner circle of his confidence. Helmut Schmidt followed him as a chancellor, and he himself was not very much interested in inter-German affairs. So the Ständige Vertretung established rather independently its work as link between East and West. When it came to the change to Helmut Kohl in 1982, the situation changed because Kohl repeatedly stated the German question, the question of the divided nation, as he said, keeps being open without being on the agenda. The Steff, meanwhile, tried to help to solve citizens' all-day problems between East and West. How difficult this was for the 60 to 80 West German officials who worked and lived in East Berlin can be shown in many ways, and many examples you will find in my book. For example, to give you just an example, which has nothing to do with the picture, sorry. There was near the border between both parts of Germany, there was a village that was separated, and mostly the inhabitants lived on the one side. On the other side, there was a little lake where they took for the fire engine the water off in case of a fire, and this was no longer possible. So these were really essential and crucial problems that occurred from the division. And the Ständige Vertretung, of course, had a lot of official negotiations, like about opening the motorway between Hanover and West Berlin and the motorway between Hamburg and West Berlin. But they solved a lot of personal problems of the people on both sides too. Imagine if you fled, if you escaped secretly, you could not take many things with you. And many people left without their certificates from school or from university. So how to get them if there is no official contact? In these questions, the Ständige Vertretung was very important to help people. Okay. Of course, the Staatssicherheit, the Stasi, observed the ständige Vertretung and tried to keep visitors, that's what we saw before, and from entering the building. Many citizens of the GDR came in, but they knew they were registered by the Staatssicherheit. Uncomfortable situation. The Staatssicherheit observed the ständige Vertretung. I will switch to another photo right now. These were the building on the opposite side of the street, and the Staatssicherheit marked which apartment they were in order to observe what happens in the ständige Vertretung. So Stasi is an interesting chapter because the officers suspected spies among the officials in East Berlin and observed really continuously. They wanted to find this. But it was not that easy. For the Stasi, it was not easy, and not for those who came in the ständige Vertretung with a strong wish to leave the country. Many of the people who applied for help to leave, they were completely desperate, and they expected the officials from West Germany to take them by car to West Berlin, and this was an illusion. The government of GDR insisted to decide who was allowed to leave. These people had to apply for exit visa at the administrations of their hometown and nowhere else. So the officials of the Stef had to convince them to leave the building again and to return where they came from. The only thing they could do was to note the names in order to support their demand on the western side, but it was more or less no more than a way to prevent the Stasi to arrest them without leaving any traces. The West kept lists with names of those who wanted to apply for the permission to leave, and as Ingrid will tell you later, tried to obtain the permission using secret channels. This was quite a deal for the GDR because the West paid secretly for people who were officially allowed to move to the West. Some of those citizens from the GDR who wanted to move stayed in the ständige Vertretung. They did not go back, and twice in 16 years of the existence of the ständige Vertretung it had to be closed because too many people came in, more than nearly 200 people, families with children, and they could not be convinced to go back. It was in the late 1980s when people expected reforms like Gorbachev promised in the Soviet Union. The SED was not willing to modernize their system at all, so many young people, especially young people, wanted to flee, and they occupied the ständige Vertretung. In this case, a person appeared that you will mention too. It was Rechtsanwalt Vogel, a lawyer who had licenses in both parts of Germany, which was obviously a great exception, of course. He came and interfered. The famous lawyer, Wolfgang Vogel, was proceeding in situations like this. He arrived with his gold Mercedes and checked secretly with the Stasi the background of those who wanted to leave the GDR. In some cases, he could not help when people with debts, for example, tried to leave, or young men who wanted to escape from the service in the army. These cases, he couldn't do anything, but in general, the lawyer Vogel, named devil's advocate, he promised those who go back, who apply officially for a permission, Ausreiseantrag, were after some weeks allowed to move to the West. As you can imagine, it was a hard burden to leave the Stef and to believe this advocate, but in my research, I didn't find a single case where he broke his promise. This, I would like to come back perhaps, just a few sentences. It was in the end of the time of Hans Otto Bräutigam, and this was in the end of GDR. Pictures you will certainly have in your mind. The wall came down, and the ständige Vertretung now is part of history. It had been an institution of the separated Germany, and when the wall came down, the reason to be for the ständige Vertretung disappeared. Helmut Kohl and the old man on top of the SED, the leading party, got in contact directly, and unfortunately the experience of those who had worked in the ständige Vertretung was not really asked for in the process of reunification on October 3rd in 1990. The day before, Franz Bertele, the late father-in-law and the late father of Herrn Bertele, he closed his office. Today we can consider mission accomplished, and we can appreciate how many humanitarian help this institution organized in 16 years of its difficult existence between East and West. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mrs. Boysen, for your presentation. I will immediately hand over to you, Ingrid, for some details about the Swedish part in this history.
Yes. I will also have some pictures to show you very soon. Hello, everybody. I'm happy to be here. This is me. I just wanted to show you that I've been around for a while. I've been a journalist for 40 years, I think it was, in the end, mostly in Swedish television as a foreign news correspondent and as a correspondent in Vienna and in Berlin. And I like this picture also to show you, because these were the guys who were in charge in those days when I was very active and traveling. And this is actually fake news, because it's from Madame Tussauds wax cabinet. But sometimes you have to allow to be sort of a little bit fake. Anyway, these were the guys in charge, and of course, as you remember, they were fantastic times. And for me, of course, it was my highlight as a journalist to be actually at the very spot on the 9th of November, 1989, when the wall came down. And that, of course, was, as you remember, great news and very optimistic times, and people had faith in the future. Not so much the same situation today. Anyway, when I was in Berlin as a correspondent, I heard a lot about a person called Carl-Gustaf Svingel. He was a Swedish person, a personality. He was very close to the Swedish church in Berlin, and there were lots of rumors about him, that he had been, like you said, a sort of private or a secret ambassador. Anyway, that he had tried to help people to come through the wall during the Cold War times. And I was very curious about this guy, because I didn't know what was true and what was his own version of what he had done. And so, as a journalist, it's nice to have a sort of a big challenge. And this was a big challenge, to try to find out what did he really do. So this is the inside of my toilet in my apartment. And when you approach a subject like this, you have to have many ideas and thoughts about where to go and who to interview and how to find information, because I knew that what he had done was very much made in secret and very discreetly, and there were no documents to find. But of course, I wanted to go from the very beginning, also to focus a little bit on his background. And this guy, he was brought up in an orphanage in a very small village called Hjärtum, close to Trollhättan. And I went there, of course, and I found this picture, which I think is very interesting. And you can see Carl-Gustav, he's a little blonde guy to the left. And this is a picture from inside an orphanage about 1920, which I think is very interesting, that there is such a picture, and that you can see this little boy there. And I think it's also very touching to see that he's holding his own hands, because if you don't have anyone else to hold hands with, you have to hold your own hand. So anyway, I knew that he had been brought up in this orphanage, and his mother was a very poor person, and he was also in all the church archives, it says fatherless son to this woman, and she gave him to the orphanage when he was 2 years old. And of course, there were many who was then his father. And this is, of course, a very interesting issue, that it might have been the former king, Gustav V. You know, of course, that this king, he did little bit, he was a bit sort of, he did whatever he wanted to. And it could, there were rumors that he was the father, but nobody knows if this was true or not. But this is sort of a part of the picture of Carl-Gustaf Svingel, that he might have been the father. But there's absolutely no proof, and I asked also in the royal castle, and they didn't want to answer this question, of course. Anyway, Carl-Gustaf, he came from very poor conditions, and then he tried to become an opera singer, and it was he didn't do very well, so he decided to go to Germany, and he ended up in Berlin in this house which he called Haus Victoria. And as you know, Queen Victoria, she was married to Gustav V, and Svingel was the one who named this house after this queen, and he started a home for old people there to come and rest for maybe 4 weeks and have a nice time. And the Swedish church paid for this, because this was a sort of humanitarian mission. There were bad times after the war. People were poor, and there were poor living conditions. So some people could come there and stay for a few weeks and have a nice time. And Carl-Gustaf, he was in charge of this home. And he was entertaining the guests. He was singing, and he was also, they were having a nice time. They were having also Swedish, they celebrated midsummer, and they had guests from Sweden, and they also had a very nice kitchen, and it was a very nice place. And it then became a very special place after a while, because Svingel, he was a person that wanted to mix into politics also. He wanted to be someone. And he invited people to Haus Victoria for dinners. And here is one of his friends, as you recognize, Willy Brandt. There were many others who were invited into his home. And this became a sort of a neutral house where East and West could meet, because as you heard just now from Jacqueline, that it wasn't possible. There were no relations between, this is in the 60s, of course, where the wall also had been built, and there were no place where they could meet and have discussions, especially about the issue of people who wanted to leave GDR. There were lists with prisoners in prisons who West Germany wanted to get by. It was like a trade of people, and many of these negotiations took place in Haus Victoria. This is how it looks today. It's a very beautiful house. It's owned by a private person, and he was kind enough to let us enter, and we went into the basement of the house, where Svingel had also a few apartments where refugees were allowed to stay for a few weeks when they just came out of the GDR. So he was helping people. Also, because of his connections on both sides of the wall, he could influence some of the decisions to give people this sort of legitimate exit visa, which some people applied for. I also got his passport, which is very interesting to see how many borders he crossed. And the interesting thing is also that he was not a diplomat, but he manufactured his own signs on his car, because it was easier then for him to cross the border. So he did a little bit as he liked. But this is it's a very interesting document, because there were so many border controls in those days, and you can really follow his trip, his life through his passport. I also found quite interesting things in Haus Victoria's guest books, because I received 2 of these books, and there you can see everybody who had been visiting there. Many of them had really also been writing something in the guest book, and you can see on top there it says Herbert Wehner. Many of you know that he was a very influential West German politician. He was also minister in several of Willy Brandt's governments, and he was also a person very much involved in this trade of people that took place between GDR and West Germany. And in the middle there you see Wolfgang Vogel, that was the lawyer that Jacqueline also mentioned. He was a very good close friend to Svingel, and he was had really mandate also to decide who was able to be allowed to exit the GDR in those days. So it was a very important person. And you see also the name of Sommerlath, which of course some of you know that was the name of our queen before she married. And I was very curious to know who were these people from her family that visited Haus Victoria in those days, and how could Svingel know them? And I didn't know anything about her history in GDR. So I tried to get an interview with her in this subject, and it was rejected many times, but I kept trying and said maybe someday she would like to talk about this. And in the meantime, I tried to do more research, and here's another picture of, you see, Wolfgang Vogel, the lawyer, and Herbert Wehner, and they were very close friends, and they met in Öland, because Herbert Wehner had a summer house there in a place called Spjutterum, and that's where they met quite a lot together also with Svingel, and that's where they also negotiated these lists of people who wanted to leave East Germany. And Herbert Wehner had an interesting history in Sweden before, in his youth, because he was actually a spy, or he was considered a spy by the Swedish secret police. So he was arrested, and this is a picture from the Swedish security police archives, where he was arrested in 1942, and he was convicted for spying, and he was also had to spend time in several prisons in Sweden, but he was quite happy about that because he was not deported to Germany during the war, because he was, of course, the enemy of the Nazis, so he wouldn't have survived very long if he would have left Sweden in those days. Here's another picture of Herbert Wehner sitting in his summer house in Spjutterum, which he loved very much. But he was a very important person in this interesting trade, and there were decisions being made about prisoners, and then when they came out in buses, Svingel was one of them who took care of people and helped them in the beginning, their first steps in the West, and to get contact again with their relatives, which was very important. And there were also some other special dramas. This is a picture of the priest in the Swedish church, Herbert Jansson. He was like Svingel, he was also gay, and he loved wonderful cars, just like Svingel did. That was a mutual interest. And he was actually a diplomat, because he was employed also as a diplomat in the Swedish church in those days. And he had legal signs on his car. And Svingel and Herbert, they were both traveling a lot crossing the border, helping people in GDR with medicines and whatever, spare parts or whatever they needed. And one day they were asked if they could also smuggle out people in their cars. And Svingel wasn't that courageous, so he said, no, I don't, it's illegal, I don't want to do that. But Herbert Jansson, he was the priest, he was a bit more adventurous, so he said, okay, I will do that. I will help some people to get out in my car. So he took out this spare wheel out of his trunk in the car and put it inside the car, and then he drove across the border, and there he met with this couple who was, he was a priest called Martin Helmer, and his wife. And they had both been helping people to escape from GDR, and they were chased by the secret police, and they had to get out very fast. And I was, of course, this was an interesting story, of course, and they were jumped into the car, into the trunk. Herbert Jansson drove to Checkpoint Charlie, which most of you know where that is, and there he was stopped by the border police, and they said, why is this spare wheel lying here in the car, and what's going on? And these two were lying there in the trunk listening to this, and they were, of course, very afraid, because they would have been in prison for 20 years if they had been caught. Anyway, Herbert Jansson, he was skilled enough to get out of that border region, and he passed the border and went into the West, and there they could start a new life. And I, of course, wanted to find out what happened to this couple. after this. So I tried to Google and I tried to find some link to this person called Helmer, and I found a church in Munich, and they said, yes, we had someone here called Helmer, but he died in the 70s. And his wife also, she lived here, but he died. So I said, but do you have any other person called? This was the wife, a beautiful picture of her. I said, do you have anyone here, any more people called Helmer who live here nearby? I said, yes, there is one more here, and they have a telephone number. And I called the number, and this was the woman who was in the trunk who answered the phone. And she was 90 plus, and very interesting person, and who told me her story and her feelings and what they were thinking when they were lying in this trunk, and very afraid of what was going to happen to them. So that was an interesting event to find her after all these years. So that was great. That gives you new energy to go on with your research. Anyway, back to Carl-Gustaf Svingel and a little bit more about his relationship with the Swedish Queen. This is a picture from 91 from Berlin, and you recognize the young woman there to the left. It's the Crown Princess Victoria. She was there too, and Carl-Gustaf is in the center. Very happy, of course, to be close to the Queen. He loved the royal house very much, the royal court, and the Queen especially. And I had been keeping on trying to get an interview with her about her her East German relatives, and they said no all the time, and I kept on, and I made a very scientific research about her family conditions. It wasn't very easy because there were quite a few of them, and many of them also in East Germany, in the region of Leipzig. I tried to call people, nobody wanted to answer. But then in the end, the doors of the Swedish castle, the royal castle, opened, and I was allowed to enter and to have a conversation with the Swedish Queen, together with Leif Sjöström, who is here tonight, who is a diplomat and who was a sort of calming factor in this situation. And he's also, since he's also head of the Swedish-German Society here, and the Queen trusted him very much. So we had a long conversation, and it was like she was talking very much about her situation and for her relatives in East Germany. So I was very surprised to get so much interesting information from her. We met 5 times, and after that there was no problem for me to get my book published. But it was, of course, a book about Carl-Gustaf Svingel, and this is my last picture of him, which is my favorite. Here you can see him parking where it's not allowed, and also he has his fake registration CC on his car, and he was sort of a little bit doing whatever he wanted to, but he was also helping quite a few people, and this is what I tried to gather in my research in this book, because I feel that he was a person, it wasn't known what he had been doing, and I felt that this is important to highlight also an individual who he acted in the way he could, and he wanted to help people, and he had a great heart. We will hear more about him soon, and I just think it's also an interesting life to come from an orphanage in a small place like that and to become a part of this big, interesting political situation in Berlin. And then I will now show my picture here, which is going to lead over to Kristina. Thank you so much so far. Thank you.
So, yeah, this was a very discreet way of putting the picture into context. Thank you very much. I'm very touched. Actually, these are my parents when they were young. Good-looking people, I find. So why am I telling you this? Because, well, some of you know already, we owe a lot, everything, my parents would say, to Carl-Gustaf Svingel. But maybe I just briefly tell you how everything developed. So as far as I understood, my parents met in 1963. My mother had left East Germany before the wall was built, so she was very clever. She was only 18 years old, wanted to study medicine, and knew that she wouldn't be able to do that in the East. So she decided to leave, and then she met my father. I don't want to share the details, would take too much time. But so she was allowed to travel, coming from the West, and so they met either in East Berlin or in Prague or in Budapest. And so they kept on meeting and dating. And then one of the closest friends of my father was then studying in the East, Gerd Blümel, who is here today. And it's a great joy for me that you made it to share your experiences later on. So actually, Gerd already left East Berlin and, as I understood, promised my father also to help him. And so it was thanks to Gerd Blümel that my mother got in contact with Carl-Gustaf Svingel. So she knocked on the door. We have all seen the beautiful house in Berlin, and asking for help in order to get, so to say, the official papers so that my father could leave the country. So Svingel promised his help. Maybe it was also helpful that he, like my mother, I don't know, this is just an assumption. But so he was very dedicated, and of course my parents were nervous and couldn't wait, but it took quite some time. And then my mother was pregnant with me, and so my father was kind of kicked out of university, and very uncertain times started. And so apparently one day after I was born, he was called in by the Stasi and interrogated in a very stressful way, and he didn't know what would happen. And so what he said, which was true, he was referring this Stasi officer to the fact that he was on the list. So we've heard about this list before. And so the Stasi officer apparently checked with his superiors back in Berlin, and took quite some time to make the phone call. But when he came back, he was very disappointed, but my father was released. So kind of a happy ending on that day, but he didn't know how long it would take. So he was not allowed to go back to university. And then, yeah, after 8 months of waiting, he got the information, or my parents got the information that he would be allowed to leave the country, which was on the 2nd September 1967. Very much to his surprise, maybe this is a very German approach. So everything was, written in papers and so on. He was asked if he wanted to take something along, like as if he moved from Paris to London. And so he said, okay, I cannot believe it, but if they ask me, I know what to take. I want to take my grand piano, my Steinway that had been given to him by his parents. So actually he left the country with the piano, which is standing upstairs now in our apartment, and with some other, things that were dear to him, and he arrived in the West. And so the next thing he did, of course, is go to West Berlin, knock on the door of Carl-Gustaf Svingel, and thank him for his support, because, as you said, he kept his word. He helped my parents. He also helped my parents to raise an important amount of money, because it cost 10,000 mark to get my father out. So Svingel was very helpful in finding a family who provided my parents with loan-free, interest-free, so to say, loan, and so which they paid back, of course. So, I mean, this story, which I tried to shorten as much as possible, has been told over and over. So I grew up with it, and I never met Svingel, but it seemed to me that he must have been some godlike figure, at least somebody who loves other human beings and who seemed to be very, very helpful. And so we owe a lot to him, and as I said also on our National Day, it's very special for me. It means a lot to me that I can serve as a German ambassador here to Sweden. So thank you for listening. All right, but now we have some more pictures. Okay, all right. Yes, there they are. Yes. All right, so now I'm happy to welcome more guests who are with us and who can share other very interesting perspectives to our topic. And so I will immediately hand over to my colleague, our press attaché, Dr. Clarissa Blomqvist. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Beinhoff. And one of the many couples that were helped by Carl-Gustaf Svingel were, as we've already heard, Gerd and Karin Blümel. And I'm very happy to stand here today with Dr. Gerd Blümel, who came to Stockholm for the occasion. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Yes. Already as a young man, you decided to leave the GDR. You fled over the so-called green border, the Bulgarian-Yugoslavian border, where border controls were relatively easy and not so strict. And your girlfriend at the time, Karin, was still in East Germany. What happened then? So how did she get in touch? And you, with Carl-Gustaf Svingel, we would like to know how did it then come that she could escape?
Well, before I left and all plans were ready, I had asked her whether, in case there would be an opportunity to go to the West without too much risk, whether she would be willing to come. She said yes. I was happy. And when I was in the West then, I looked for this opportunity. And I found somebody, a student of the West Berlin so-called Free University, who had helped digging tunnels through the wall in 1963, 1964. And as maybe some of you know, some people would be able to leave through these tunnels and others were caught in East Germany. Carl-Gustav was in the process of helping these people to get out of the prisons and to go to the West. And I got to know one of the West Berlin students who knew Carl-Gustav. And he said, I know somebody, this is a Swede in Grunewald, he had helped my friends, maybe you try to ask him whether he would help you. And he asked whether Carl-Gustav would be willing to receive me, to accept me. He said yes, and so I met Carl-Gustav and told him our story. And he said, yes, fine, I will try to help you. Now, this was a little bit easier than in the case of the parents of Christina, because my girlfriend, today's wife Karin, had a father living in West Germany. And this was and so it was a so-called family reunification. So that was easier than just if people are engaged.
Mm. So what exactly did Carl-Gustaf Svingel then do?
Carl-Gustav noted all the details, and he said, now I would like to see this young lady in East Berlin. Now, this again was not easy for me, because I, of course, could not go to East Berlin. All West Berliners could not go to East Berlin, so we had to find somebody who was with a West German pass. And he, actually it was a she, went to East Berlin, met my girlfriend, and arranged with her a date with Carl-Gustav. And some weeks later, they met in front of the Humboldt University at Unter den Linden in Berlin. And he came with his Volvo Sport, we saw, and they immediately moved to the office of Mr. Vogel. And then again, all the details were taken, and yes, a lot of administration, and at the end of the day, she could leave East Germany.
So you can really say that Carl-Gustaf Svingel, with his help, your life changed.
Absolutely.
You then, I read, got married in Haus Victoria, which we've seen in the picture before, and then you also lived and worked there for a while. What are your memories of the place and of the person, Carl-Gustaf Svingel? What did you notice?
The place was just a very calm place. Despite the fact that every 3 weeks about 25 people came from East Germany, pensioners, But they lived on the first floor and then the second floor. And the ground floor, there was the office of Carl-Gustav, and there were comfortable lounges. So it was very calm and nice. Carl-Gustav was very friendly. Sometimes he was challenging to his staff, but always in a very friendly manner.
And did you notice anything about the politicians and the lawyer Vogel who walked in and out of the...
What I actually personally noticed was the lawyer's Vogel car parking in the garden of Haus Victoria. But at least every 2 weeks, I met Carl-Gustav. We became friends. In the evenings, we had a drink together, and Carl-Gustav was talking a lot about history, his life, and of course also about the circumstances under which he tried to help East Germans to come to the West.
We have some pictures here. Could you comment?
Yes, on this picture, this is the day of my marriage, 19th of January 1969, in a restaurant at the Kurfürstendamm in Berlin. Carl-Gustav, my wife Karin, and believe it or not, that's me on the right-hand side. Okay. Here he is congratulating us in front of the church in the Hansaviertel in Berlin. It was quite cold in January. And most importantly, in the back, my first car, a DKW, I bought for 350 Deutschmarks. In front, the 2 children who put flowers, their mother, and then again the bride, my wife Karin, and myself. Mm. And this is in Haus. No, this is also after the official marriage in the town hall, after the marriage at lunch. And this is in the evening during the dinner party in Haus Victoria. Yes, and that is us. And on the right-hand side, some years later.
Yes, then and now, and as again, life-changing personality. What, if it maybe it's difficult to say, but the contact to Svingel proved to be life-changing. What would have been your options otherwise? What did you consider if you hadn't met Carl-Gustaf Svingel?
If I hadn't met Carl-Gustav, I would have tried to get my girlfriend to the West. Whether this would have been successful or not, I don't know. I don't know what would have happened. I don't know whether we would be together. Mm.
Well, then let's stay on this happy note and thank Carl-Gustaf, and thank you very much for sharing your story and coming to Stockholm. May I please invite our next guest, Dr. Karin Westin Tikkanen, please. Yes, because we have heard a lot now about Carl-Gustaf Svingel, but apart from Carl-Gustaf Svingel, there was actually another Swede who played an important role in organizing escape help, Leif Persson. And in 1961, at the time when the Berlin Wall was built, he was a 22-year-old sociology student at the University of Lund who traveled to Berlin with a group of friends. And Karin Tikkanen met Leif Persson on a train outside of Gothenburg shortly before his death. Karin is a linguist, researcher and journalist and author of the book Flykten genom Berlin, Svenskarna i Stasis arkiv, also Escape Through Berlin, Swedes in the Stasi Archives. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And first of all, could you say something about the general situation when Leif Persson came to Berlin, when overnight in 1961 the wall was built? How did people in West Berlin then try to help fellow friends, citizens in the East?
Well, as we heard, as Jacqueline told us just a few minutes ago, people were escaping the GDR up until the 12th of August in 1961. They were leaving, hundreds of people every day. They were leaving, crossing the border while it was open. And on the Sunday when the border was closed, and also the day afterwards before the wall itself was actually built, people were still trying to leave. They were jumping the cross wires, climbing out where they could. And in West Berlin, on the west side, people did what they could to help them get out. We've heard many stories about Carl-Gustaf Svingel, working on the political, very high administrative level, diplomacy. But people were also helping refugees get out of the GDR in a more secretive way, much like Harry Johnson, who smuggled people out in his car. So, on the days after the border had been closed in Berlin, if you were walking around, you could see mattresses laid out on the ground to help people who were jumping from roofs or climbing out of windows. You could also see ladders being posted up on walls for people to be able to climb down on when they were getting out. But there were also more active ways of trying to help people get out. And at the Freie University in West Berlin, there was a group of students, two young men, Detlef Girman and Dieter Thieme. They had a background in East Germany themselves, but they had escaped to the West. And they were in charge of helping students with administrative issues to do with studying, getting scholarships or getting visas if they had to. So before the border was closed, there were a number of students living in East Berlin who were studying at the Freie University in West Berlin. So Girman and Thieme, they had a complete collection of names of these East Berlin students, and they set out contacting them. They sent out people to talk to them who said, "Do you want to escape? Do you want to get out? Or do you want to get out?" And then they went around in West Berlin and collecting West German ID cards that were similar picture-wise to the people who wanted to get out. And then they would return back to East Berlin and hand out these identification cards, allowing people to walk out through Checkpoint Charlie, pretending to be living in West Berlin or West Germany. So this was a way of actively, well, this was breaking the law, but in seemingly not so dangerous way at the beginning.
So how then did Leif Persson get involved with this German group?
Well, Leif Persson, he traveled down to West Berlin in November of 1961. This was a few months after the border had been closed. And at a nightclub, when he was out drinking in the evening, he happened to start talking to one of the students who was active in this group. As you said, it's called the German-Gruppe. And this young student suggested to Leif that he should join him to the Freie University the day after to meet Detlef Girman and Dieter Thieme. And this meant that when Leif then went home to Sweden a few days later, he had been told to collect Swedish passports to bring down to West Berlin. He would either bring them or he would send them by post. And then the group, in a similar way, the doppelganger method, would go around East Berlin handing out Swedish passports for people to flee, walking out through Checkpoint Charlie. And Leif did this for about 5 months. He collected hundreds of passports, at least 120 passports that I know of, specifically, that he collected and brought down.
Was he aware of the risks that he took, and how did it then go for him?
Well, the thing is that he was, in the end, caught and charged with conspiracy to help people escape the GDR. I think that many people who work with these things, and when they are in the early 20s, there's a period when you think that you are immortal, that nothing will happen to you. And Leif Persson, he might have been aware of the risks, but he didn't really care about them. He really wanted to help people escape. And then at one point in the spring of 1963, in March 1963, he went by train from Lund down to Berlin. He at that point he thought that it'd been more than 1 year since he smuggled passport the last time. I think I'm safe. So he took a train, and then he was actually caught in Sassnitz. He was taken and charged and brought to Hohenschönhausen in East Berlin, where they kept him and interrogated him very, very harshly for several weeks.
Yes, we know from other sources how terrible that experience must have been. But I think he was there for 6 weeks, so not compared to others, not so very long. But what happened then? Why was he released, and how did it go for him back in Sweden?
Well, I think that Leif became a token in a game of appearances. The GDR, they were very anxious to keep up a good relationship with Sweden. They wanted to be on good terms. And when Leif was in prison in East Berlin, Swedish newspapers wrote loads about him. He was on the cover of every magazine in Sweden for a couple of weeks. Journalists were asking several questions, many questions, and there were many marches arranged, protest marches arranged in Sweden and also in Germany to get Leif Persson out of prison. And this didn't really appeal to the GDR. They didn't like it very much that Swedes were having opinions or that the Swedes were asking the wrong kind of questions. So in the end, they decided to have a press conference. A big press conference was arranged in the East Berlin, where Leif got to stand up and tell the whole story, the whole narrative of what he had done and how he had helped the West German terrorists commit crimes against the GDR. And then he was let go.
And can you tell us a little bit more about how his life then developed later on after this experience in Hohenschönhausen and with Germany?
Well, I can keep it very short and say that he didn't have a very good life after his time in Hohenschönhausen. Before he went there, before he was charged, he was a very social, very happy person. He had several friends. But when he got out of Hohenschönhausen and went home, he cut contacts with all of his old friends in Lund and in West Berlin. And for a little while, he had difficulties with alcohol, and he died on his own. He never got a family. He died a very solitary person.
Yes, not such a happy note, but thank you. We are lucky, however, that we have his story here, that you met him on the train and listened to him and wrote down his story, because before he hadn't thought about writing anything down, or...
He did try to write a book by himself, and I was lucky to get hold of his manuscript, but that book was never published. It was like many books written by more amateur writers. He put it away in a drawer and forgot about it.
Well, thank you then for finishing the job and for coming here. Thank you very much, Karin Westin Tikkanen. Yes, and now I would like to turn over to our next guest, Professor Birgitta Almgren. Professor Birgitta Almgren, Professor Emerita in German from the Södertörn Högskola, Södertörn University in Stockholm. You have done extensive research on German-Swedish relations, and you have published widely about GDR-Sweden relationships. You have published Inte bara Stasi, relationerna Sverige-DDR, also not just Stasi, relations between Sweden and the GDR 1949 to 1990, which has just had a new edition, I think.
Yes.
And then a bit later, Inte bara spioner, not just spies. And there you digged into the Stasi archives, and I think also in Säpo archives here in Sweden. So very warm welcome, and thank you for coming. And could you please characterize a little bit for us the relation, quite complex relation, maybe between Sweden and East Germany?
Also these relations is a brilliant question. Even after more than 30 years, the past is never dead. The official Sweden showed goodwill and kindness towards GDR. Swedish ministers visited GDR and praised the success of the new country. Olof Palme visited GDR and he said nothing about the prisoners who were in prison because they were social democrats and they were great disappointed. They had protested against the powerful party SED and the methods. And Ingvar Carlsson, he also, for example, congratulated Erik Honecker to the 40th anniversary of DDR. And utrikespolitikens dagsfrågor, 2 years before the fall of the wall, they wrote, also the journalist and researcher, he wrote, här i DDR blommar det småborgerliga livet för fullt. En ljus framtid ser vi här i DDR. He compared DDR with a fairy tale of Elsa Beskow. Total nostalgic. He saw behind the grey walls, he saw pride, joy, and happiness. And yes, I think much of the explanation to the goodness and kindness towards DDR was that there are threads back to the dictatorship of Hitler, the Nazi regime. Many against Hitler, they escaped to Sweden and they kept their friendship, and after 1945 they returned to Germany and became leaders of the new country, and they could cooperate with the Swedish politicians. But also, if you try to generalize, the opinion in Sweden in general varied between an image of fascinating, attractive socialist model state, and also a grey, dull, peaceful welfare state, and a frightening, horrific state. The first conference in Sweden has been much talk about relations between the other countries, but what happened in Sweden. And when I published this book, Inte bara Stasi, there were debates. Was it possible that we had so much connections with a horrific state, with repression, prisons, and summary executions? And you can see that the longer DDR existed, the more time elapsed, the more positive was the attitude in general, also among Swedish journalists. When Palme visited Stralsund, Svenska Dagbladet Conservative wrote very positive about Honecker, en mäktig ledare med glimten i ögat. Han är sympatisk och verkligen att tro på.
But were there some critical voices too?
There were, but for example, Stellan Arvidsson, the well-known school politician, member in Swedish parliament, he warned for hateful propaganda. And he said, DDR is on the track to a Democrat. And that is, I think it's very, you have to see the many voices in Sweden, and that then you can better evaluate the cooperation. For example, the cooperation of school policy started in early 60s, and Stellan Arvidsson always warned for criticizing DDR.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the other perspective. You wrote that Sweden was important for the GDR as a bridge and buffer between East and West. Why was Sweden important? In which way was Sweden important to the GDR?
Sweden was a support for DDR to attain international political recognition of the government, which came 1972, and was a non-aligned country. And I think also Sweden was an important country, excellent for beginners as EM agents, for training DDR spies. We know, here in Sweden, they learned how a capitalistic country functioned. And many Swedes were naive, and they couldn't hear the differences between East German dialects, Saxish or West German dialects. And I think also Swedes were naive and closed their eyes.
You studied Stasi archives and Serpo archives. I'm afraid we don't have so much time to go into detail here, but what was the maybe most interesting for you that you found when you looked at it?
The Stasi were interested in the Swedes and wanted to know who is positive and who is negative. Who can we give scholarships, who can get wonderful visits in luxuous hotels in East Germany. And the official Sweden was so positive, and why? There were voices who asked, why should the Swedish government help people to flee from a paradise, a country with no unemployment, no pornographic papers, and no prostitution?
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Almgren. Maybe we can comment and ask more questions about these interesting topics when we now open up and come to a discussion. Thank you very much for coming.
But I just want to say, it's a great difference between Germany and Sweden when it's the law and what researchers can get access to. For example, when I wrote this Inte bara spioner, I was reported at once. It was a crime, said Säpo, against secrecy. But after 1 year, the Justitiekanslern said, no crime. It was a victory for research.
Yeah, good. Thank you very much. Over to you, Ambassador Beinhoff.
Yeah, so I would like to open the floor now, as you have announced already, for discussions and questions. I mean, there are more number of here in the room who have made some personal experience and have maybe some knowledge they would like to share. So please, the floor is open for questions or comments.
Maybe just the first question to Ingrid Törnqvist. If you can say us a bit about how Svingel made it possible to have this network, to be such an important go-between between these two systems, and what may have been the interest on the other side to be in contact with him. So was it as well on reputation again? Was it on money? Was it as well the interest of a link, political link to the West, which made him so worthy for both sides?
Well, I think the East and West needed a place to, or communication between these countries, and they didn't have any. And Svingel was then the person who made it possible, both in House Victoria, which was not an embassy, it was not an official Swedish institution, it was just a rest home, a home for old people. That made it possible for them to meet in sort of neutral territory, which was very important in those days, because they needed a place to have these very sensitive negotiations also. And then I think also Svingel himself wanted to play a part in something big and something important. And I think he had the skills also of creating networks and having many relations on both sides, and they also could trust him from both sides, and I think that was very important.
Please, if you want to add to that.
I can add something which does not comment on Svingel, but in general, this question how these lists with names of people who wanted to escape from GDR were dealt with in secret, because on the official political level, this was a no-go, but beneath and in secret, both sides dealt with the question of this kind of secret migration concerning political prisoners, and concerning normal people who wanted to leave the country, and of course those who had families and who wanted to get, like you, for example, to be able to live with your, or like your family, to live with the fiancé, or to join the family who left before. These secret channels existed, but of course nobody talked about. GDR had no interest in talking about it because they wanted to avoid people to do the same, to apply for Ausreise, to try. They wanted, of course, the people to stay in their country, and the West had no interest. They don't wanted to attract people to apply for Ausreise. And of course, they wanted, the official side on the West wanted to avoid a discussion about the money they paid, the West paid for the East. And this money question is still a very big one and a crucial one, because of course in international law, Menschenhandel, to deal with the lives of human, is illegal. Although we know there are cases where there's no other way, let's say, to solve this question. So secretly, money flew. There was a flow of money, of course, and it was a big amount of money. In the late 80s, West Germany paid up to 100,000 Deutsche Mark for political prisoners or for Ausreisewillige per person. For GDR, this meant they got Devisen, they got Western currency, which was important for the very poor situation of the GDR's economy. It was managed by interference of the church. The Protestant church in West Germany had they They had secret channels too, and they had 2 lawyers. At least we know about 2 lawyers. There must have been more, perhaps, who transported this money in their suitcase, crossing the border with a permission, an official permission. But of course, dealing with these questions were top secret thing, because no one wanted people to do the same, to be to feel invited to leave their hands and to show I want to go too. That would have been a big exodus from GDR, of course.
And they also appealed to the press not to write about this.
Oh yes,
which they agreed not to do.
Yeah, they really didn't do, and even those who were transported in the buses we saw in one of your pictures, in the bus, they got the instruction, don't talk about it. And they arrived in the West and shut up.
I think Professor Gaberding has joined us. I will give you the floor immediately, Staffan. So she's professor of ethnology at Södertörns University and has done extensive research on the relations between Swedish and East German musicians. And Professor Gaberding, please take the floor and share some information that you have gathered in your research.
Thank you, but I'm just not a professor, I'm just a lecturer, associate professor in ethnology at Södertörns University. Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
That's nice, okay. Yes, thank you for the introduction, and thank you for very interesting presentations and discussion. And I've just done a project on the musical relations between Sweden and the GDR, together with 2 colleagues in history and musicology. And we found out, for adding this to Birgitta Almgren's talk, that the relations between Sweden and the GDR were very close, but there were also very variety between the opinions, what Swedish musicians thought about the GDR. And there were different groups, and the left-wing politics in Sweden was very important. That many musicians, they really admired the GDR, especially the classical music life in the GDR had very high status in Sweden, and many Swedish musicians wanted to perform in the GDR, and they also were very impressed by the GDR cultural policy, because the GDR government spent much money in the cultural life. Of course, they want to spread political propaganda abroad, especially in Sweden. Sweden was a very important country for the political propaganda. But one important person for the Stasi in Sweden was the musicologist and professor of musicology Gerd Schönfelder, and he also was a leader of the Semper Opera in Dresden in the 80s. And he was elected in the Royal Academy of Music in Stockholm, and he also was a spy for the Stasi and reported regularly to the Stasi. And this is very interesting, because I have interviewed some Swedish musicians about this, and they're very surprised that he was reporting so much about the Stasi. They were because he was a very clever Stasi employee. He had, as Birgitta Almgren had told you, he was very well trained. So he knew how to perform Swedish people about the political propaganda in the GDR, and he talked very often very critical about the GDR politics, and that's why his Swedish colleagues could not believe that he was working for the Stasi. But there were some suspicious when he was elected into the academy, already 1984, but they were not followed up. And it's interesting that the academy still worked together with Schönfelder even after the unification of Germany until 1995. And at that time, it was always known that he had worked for the Stasi. So that was a big surprise for us in our project, that they still cooperated with Schönfelder in the Royal Academy. But there also were critical voices in the music life, especially in the area of folk music, which I just started to study. And this is very interesting, because the folk music had a special position in the GDR music life. the folk musicians in the GR themselves, they described their situation as a kind of gray zone. They had a kind of free zone. They could perform music and hide secret messages in the text, in the musics, and the government had not so much eyes on them. So they were quite freely, and I also interviewed Swedish folk musicians who were in touch with these musicians. And they had a big exchange of compositions and songs and so on. So they were maybe a little bit more free than other musicians in the GDR. So that's also very interesting. These connections are very different, and how much they could execute their artistic freedom. This is very different in different musical areas. So this is also a result in our project, and we want to study this further in the future. I think I stay there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your input. And I turn to the audience. I saw one hand going up. I have two hands. Please, Stefan. Yeah. Maybe you can introduce yourself.
Yes.
Thank you.
I'm Staffan Karlsson. Some of you know me. I was ambassador to Berlin between 2010 and 2015. I have one comment and one question. The comment relates to what Ingrid Törnqvist had to say about the interesting connections here also at the political level with Svingel and the link to Herbert Wehner, who was of course a central figure. But you did mention Willy Brandt as well and showed us pictures of Willy Brandt, but one cannot understand this period in Swedish-German relations without saying that Willy Brandt was the key person here, and the relations with Willy Brandt were extremely close from the Swedish side. I have studied recently Swedish diplomacy in the 1950s. Willy Brandt became regerande Bürgermeister in Berlin in the 1950s. It was not so much in the 1950s, but later, when he was regerande Bürgermeister, but also, of course, when he went into the federal government, the ties were extremely close. He was a public person also in Sweden. He spoke Norwegian. He had lived in Stockholm during the war, and he had extremely close relations with the Swedish prime ministers of the Social Democratic Party, Tage Erlander, and of course also with Olof Palme. This was I think, in a way, an exception to the general absence of that kind of close ties. We've always been friendly, but we have not had the kinds of close ties that we had during those years. Then I would like to a small piece of information which I remember extremely well, but which I haven't checked, and that is I met in Berlin the last GDR ambassador to Stockholm. I don't remember his name.
Erich Wetzel.
Okay. He had published a paper. I don't know how much you can, but he had looked into the records of a meeting between Palme and the East German leadership it was immediately after or maybe a year after, I don't know, the Günther Guillaume scandal that led to the fall of Willy Brandt in Bonn as chancellor in 1974, May of 1974. And Palme had taken up this matter in a very, very explicit manner with according to this former East German ambassador, with the East German leadership, and he had been extremely upset. And this was reflected in the records of the meeting that the former East German ambassador had studied, and Palme had told the East German leadership that how on earth could you be so stupid? And I think it was as clear as that. To place your man in the Günther Guillaume in the vicinity of the German Chancellor. You don't know what you have been doing. And I think that was both interesting and rather pertinent. Now to the question to Dr. Boysen. There were some complications, you said, at the when after 1970, the ständige Vertretung, it was not so easy for the West German side and these military parades and so forth. One could argue, could one not, that it was even more complicated for the other side, for the East Germans. For the East Germans, I mean, the reception of Willy Brandt in Erfurt in 1970, yes. The obvious appeal that he had in the GDR was a great embarrassment.
Yes.
And much more of an embarrassment to the GDR regime than the military parades were to the government in Bonn, I would assume.
Yes, I do agree. The situation when Willy Brandt came was really not easy. Thank you so much for this remark. My empathy, perhaps, on this side was not quite not balanced, because people were shouting "Willy, Willy," and of course they meant Willy Brandt, as far as we know. And not Willy Stoph, the head of the GDR state. So these... yes. Yeah, Willy ans Fenster. Exactly. Yes, it could only be one Willy. Yeah, you are perfectly right. And I'm very grateful that you mentioned the person of Willy Brandt as a relay, perhaps, a figure that could establish different contacts. And of course, he at that time was kind of, as he had been in exile, German in Sweden, he was part of the good Germany. Don't forget the situation only 20 years, or not even 20 years after the second, and 70s or 30 years after the Second World War. So he was the one who could open up many channels we don't have, or many contacts Western Germany couldn't have before, or just established step by step. He was an important person for the relations, of course, for the so-called neutral states, and Sweden, of course, played a different role in the foreign policy of GDR than, let's say, France or Great Britain, a special role, and Austria, for example, too, in a different way, of course, and without a symbolic figure like Willy Brandt. But I'm grateful that you explained it like this.
Thank you. Maybe we take one further question. Please.
Thank you. Mats Hellström is my name. I was in the 70s in the parliament, as a member of parliament, and I was later also minister in all the Swedish governments of Olof Palme and of Ingvar Carlsson. In my view, in the 70s, the primat of Swedish foreign policy was to follow Willy Brandt's policy, not ever to go against it. That was Olof Palme, that was Torsten Nilsson, that was clearly our policy. And you can criticize that we followed the West German policy so much, but we did, certainly. And through the 70s, there was also strong ministerial contacts between West Germany and Sweden, where Swedish ministers took part in workshops in West Germany and the opposite. They come here to learn about Swedish social policy and so on. So it's very, very close relationship between West Germany and Sweden in the 1970s, certainly. And then one small point about Olof Palme and his visit in East Germany. Of course, as we recognized East Germany as part of our follow the Willy Brandt policy, you could say, also, we did that. He was asked, of course, to go to East Germany, and he wanted to cheat the East Germans. He said, clearly, I know that. I don't want to make a formal visit to East Berlin. I will tell them I go to Stralsund to show the Swedish legacy or Swedish history about when we were in the South Pommern, or not South, but in Pommern and so on. So he went to, as you know, when you mentioned it, with also somebody here, he went to Stralsund, and it was hailed there, of course. But this was a point of his not to go to East Berlin. And then also, of course, Herbert Weder did have an important role also in Sweden. He came once to the Swedish parliamentary group in the 70s, in the Social Democratic parliamentary group. And they hailed us by saying, more or less like this, "Det knallar och går! Det knallar och går!" Because this was what he had to say when he was in Swedish prison. He was in prisoner in Sweden during the Second World War. And the guards told him that if he didn't say "det knallar och går," he wouldn't get his cigarettes. That's also a small part of German politics in Sweden. "Det knallar och går," that means, oh, it's knall don't get. It's you have to show yourself.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I think we could continue for hours. Unfortunately, our time has come to an end. So we will have to finish here. But my impression is that we have triggered something, and this was the main purpose of not only casting some light of this Swedish-German relations and the courageous role that Swedes have played during the German division. So we have heard a lot about that, and so I would just like to thank you, panelists Ingrid and Jacqueline, for your input and for the background. And so I very much hope that we were not only able to bring together the audience here, but as we are also online, that we that you connected people working on this topic, and maybe we also managed to bring you in contact with one or the other. That would be very nice, and we will follow up on it. And as we have heard from Mrs. Gaberding, there's a lot of research to be done on different fields, and so there will never be a dull moment, even not in German-Swedish history during the Cold War. So thank you very much for joining.
You can buy the book.
Yes, of course.
It's over there.
Yes. So if Ingrid brought some books along, so please, have a look. And if you are interested, of course, you are able to buy it. I don't know if you brought your book also, Mrs. Boysen. If not,
Sorry.
You can order it online, I'm sure. All right, so please, thank you very much. Thank you for coming here and for joining and for sharing these partly very personal insights. And have a good day. Take care. Bye-bye.